Okay, everyone, here we go with our fifth lecture on the endocrine system. We're moving now down further into the body, looking at the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of the kidneys. But as always, let's start with our not really attendance questions. What are the function or functions of Ang2? What sex hormone do males make? What about females? And which stimulus type does the thyroid respond to? So let's see what the answers are. The function or functions of Ang2. Remember, Ang2 is the most potent vasoconstrictor in the body. So it causes vasoconstriction, which causes an increase in peripheral resistance, raising blood pressure. But it also stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And aldosterone then goes on to have its effects on blood pressure also. What sex hormone do males make? Males make testosterone, but males also make estrogen. Females make estrogen, but they also make testosterone. Both males and females make both sex hormones. Which type of stimulus category does the thyroid respond to? Remember the different types of stimulus category from our first lecture in endocrine? Well, the thyroid actually responds to more than one. The parafollicular cells, the C cells that release calcitonin, those respond to humoral stimuli, levels of calcium in the blood. The thyroid follicles are tropic. They respond to thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin.
So here is our hypothalamus pituitary chart that we keep referring to. Today, it's going to tie in a little bit. And just to walk us through it again, remember the hypothalamus releases its hormones to tell the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. In this case, today we will be talking about the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, telling the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin. Remember, that wasn't really the case, that the anterior pituitary made pro-opiomelanocortin, POMC, and the ACTH was a part of that large complex. And the ACTH is cleaved, enters circulation, travels to the adrenal cortex, and tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, aldosterone, and the androgens. And it's cortisol that feeds back to the hypothalamus to stop releasing CRH, and also to the pituitary to stop making POMC, leading to ACTH levels dropping. So today we're going to talk about the adrenal cortex and its related hormones, as well as the adrenal medulla. So here is our adrenal gland. This image is from page 640 of your textbook. And we're going to talk about the different parts of the adrenal gland and all of the hormones that are made from each layer. So collectively, the hormones made by the adrenal cortex, this outer portion, it's actually 3 layers. Collectively, those hormones are called corticosteroids. Most people have heard that term before, corticosteroids. Today we're going to be talking about what they are. Now, the corticosteroids are also broken into a few categories. First, the glucocorticoids, which is a little bit hazy in exactly what all hormones are there. We are only concerned with cortisol. So glucocorticoids, we're going to talk about cortisol, and that's it. Also, we will talk about mineralocorticoids, which primarily is aldosterone. And the gonatocorticoids, these are the androgens. Now, androgens are precursor hormones, some of which are converted to testosterone, some of which are converted to estradiol, estrogen. And we're going to talk about each of those today. Now, before we get going, I want to mention that when we look at the adrenal cortex and the 3 layers, each layer will primarily make one of those hormones, although all 3 layers do make all 3 hormones to one extent. So just remember, we are only talking about the hormone that each layer primarily produces. So before we get going on that, let's back up a little bit and look at the structure of the adrenal gland. So here is the adrenal gland. There's one on top of each kidney. Adrenal literally means on top of kidney. And we've taken a portion of that, cut it, and blown it up. Now the outer portion of the adrenal gland is this connective tissue wrapping called the adrenal capsule. Now the capsule is not responsible for making hormones. This is just a protective layer. Just beneath that is the adrenal cortex with 3 layers, and just beneath that is the adrenal medulla. So we're talking first about the adrenal cortex, and we're going to go and name the layers of the adrenal cortex. From the outside in, we've got zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Those are the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex, from most superficial to most deep, or from the outside inward. Now, let's talk about what these look like under a microscope, because you are responsible for that in lab, and I do cover this in the lab slide video, but I want to talk about it a little bit here. Glomerulus, we saw that back in the kidneys. Well, glomerule really just means spherical or ball-like. And when we look at the zona glomerulosa, it looks like these little balls under a microscope. It's these little round structures. Here we can see several of them. Moving inward, the zona fasciculata and the zona reticularis. Now the zona fasciculata, it's a little hard to see in this image. In the slide show that I do on the lab video, you can see that really it kind of looks like these ropes are folded back and forth on each other. We'll see an image of that here in just a little bit on the whiteboard. And then the zona reticularis. Now the zona reticularis, sometimes it doesn't take stain very well, except for the nuclei. The nuclei stain really, really darkly. So the zona reticularis sometimes can be pretty faint, but it's always got some really, really dark nuclei there. And then the adrenal medulla, although we can't see it in this image here, the adrenal medulla usually has some very large open spaces, and that's where blood vessels run through. So we'll look at this again in just a little bit on the whiteboard, but I wanted to talk about the layers that we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to talk about the zona glomerulosa, and this is the outermost layer. This is where the mineralocorticoid aldosterone comes from. Aldosterone. Now, we've mentioned aldosterone some already this semester. Now we're talking about where does it come from, what are some more details about aldosterone. So its stimulus, we've already talked about being Ang2. Ang2 stimulates aldosterone as part of the renin-angiotensin mechanism. But what stimulated Ang2? Well, originally there was a drop in blood pressure that set the renin-angiotensin mechanism in motion. But there are some other stimuli for aldosterone. Increases in blood potassium. When your blood potassium is high, that can stimulate aldosterone. ACTH. Well, remember ACTH stimulates all 3 layers of the adrenal cortex to release all of their hormones. And also decreases in blood sodium. When your blood sodium levels drop, that stimulates aldosterone. What are some things that inhibit aldosterone? Well, increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, and decreased blood potassium levels. What's its function? We've already talked about that. Sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. It does that to raise blood volume and blood pressure. How does it do it? Stimulates those tubule cells to make sodium-potassium pumps. So let's talk about some disorders. Hypersecretion typically from an adrenal tumor, but we'll see later that it could also be from some information, some problems that can go wrong with the anterior pituitary. So hypersecretion of aldosterone is called aldosteronism, or sometimes you'll see it hyperaldosteronism. This leads to things like hypertension, edema, low blood potassium, causing weakness and paralysis. Hyposecretion is Addison's disease. Now, Addison's disease actually concerns both aldosterone and cortisol, so we're going to talk about that here in just a moment when we talk about cortisol. So let's move down and talk a little bit about cortisol. Moving down to the next layer of the cortex, the zona fasciculata. This is the second layer in of the cortex. Like I said, it seems kind of folded up under the microscope. Its stimulus is ACTH, and that's it. It's inhibited by negative feedback. When cortisol levels rise, we said that it feeds back. It cuts off the hypothalamus, making CRH, and it cuts off the anterior pituitary, making ACTH. Its function, it's got several functions. Gluconeogenesis. Maybe you heard that word back in Bio 137, maybe not. It literally means formation of new sugars, but what it actually is you take something like fat and convert it into a carbohydrate, a sugar, glucose. So you're making a carbohydrate out of something that was not previously a carbohydrate. You're converting fat into sugar. It increases blood glucose, mobilizes fats for metabolism. All that means is it makes adipose tissue easy and ready to break down for energy. Protein catabolism. It also breaks down proteins. It helps resist stress. When you're stressed, remember, that's one of the stimuli for CRH, which stimulates ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, including cortisol. And cortisol is going to help resist stress. When you're really stressed out, your cortisol levels are up. But some other functions, it decreases inflammation and it decreases your immune response. So when you are under a lot of stress for a long time, you may have noticed you start to look pretty haggard. You start to get sick really easily. And that's because your inflammation responses and your immune response have basically been cut off. People who are under stress for a really long time tend to get sick really easily. And that's because of cortisol. So hypersecretion is called Cushing's syndrome, or sometimes you'll hear it called Cushing's disease. And here are some signs. They're called the Cushingoid signs. And I always hate reading these because it really sounds like they're just making fun of the person that has them. But these are the actual technical terms for these. Moon face, that just means the face is very, very rounded. Buffalo hump, that's a kind of fat pad on the upper part of the neck. Unusual fat distribution, and really what that means is the arms and the legs don't really get that much bigger, but right around the midsection, a lot of weight is put on. So the person can look obese except for their arms and legs. Unusual tanning, and this is from that increased ACTH that we mentioned last time, because in Cushing's, it's actually a pituitary tumor that's causing it. The pituitary tumor is causing increased ACTH, and the ACTH can stimulate melanocytes. Now, unlike just having, a nice tan all over your body, in Cushing's, you start to have tanning in splotches. There will be certain spots that are really tan and certain spots that aren't. And it doesn't even have to be areas that are exposed to sunlight, because it's not making melanin in response to sun, it's making melanin in response to ACTH. So you'll see tanning spots in places that never see the sunlight even. We also get easy bruising, poor wound healing, and something called steroid diabetes. So remember I told you there are lots of types of diabetes. Here's a fifth type, steroid diabetes. And what happens here is because of the increased cortisol levels, the blood sugar levels are up. There's a lot of excess glucose. So it can kind of resemble diabetes mellitus. You still have excess glucose. Glucose exceeds transport maximum. And you have a lot of urine output with high concentration because there's going to be a lot of glucose in it. The specific gravity will be really high. Hyposecretion is Addison's disease, as we saw up with aldosterone. In Addison's disease, there's not enough aldosterone, there's not enough cortisol. You get things like weight loss, low blood glucose, low blood sodium, high blood potassium, dehydration, and hypotension. Hypotension is low blood pressure. So let's look at why each of those are. The low blood glucose, well, that's because there's not enough cortisol. Cortisol helps raise blood glucose. Low blood sodium and high blood potassium, that's because of no aldosterone. And if you have low blood sodium, more sodium is leaving the body in the urine, taking water with it. So you get the dehydration, and you also get hypotension as your blood levels drop, as your blood volume levels drop. And we can treat Addison's with hormone replacement therapy. If you give synthetic or supplemental corticosteroids, that will help with Addison's disease. Moving inward further, we get to the zona reticularis. Zona reticularis, this is where the androgens, estrogen and testosterone, are made. Here, now, this will play a much larger role in females than in males. In males, the testosterone is masked by the testosterone coming from the testes, and the estrogen is kind of overshadowed by the effects of the testosterone, although estrogen does play a big role in how our body manages calcium. Its stimulus is ACTH. It's inhibited by, we don't know. We know that it's not negative feedback. Cortisol is the one that does the negative feedback, but we're not really sure what the inhibitors are. Its function, like I said, in males is pretty insignificant. Estrogens do play a role a little bit in calcium maintenance, but not important. In females, it drives libido, which is the sex drive. It also is responsible for body hair growth. And after menopause, this is the only source of estrogen in females. Normally, prior to menopause, the estrogen comes from the ovaries. But after menopause, the ovaries stop making estrogen, and all of the estrogen comes from the zona reticularis. Hypersecretion, not so much in males. We don't really see any significance in males, but in females, hypersecretion can lead to masculinization, basically showing masculine characteristics, increased body hair, deeper voice, and also virilization, which is just another term for increased sex drive. So let's go over to our whiteboard and talk a little bit about some of the things that we've just said, but just kind of tie it together nicely. So over here, this is my awesome artwork of the adrenal gland. Up here at the top, this is the adrenal capsule. Doesn't play any role in endocrine. Then we have 3 layers of the cortex, the zona glomerulosa, the zona vesiculata, the zona reticularis. Here's our little round structures, the glomerulosa. Here's our folded back and forth vesiculata, and our dark staining nuclei, the reticularis. Now, I've got underlined here a way to help us keep these in order, because those are some crazy names. How do we know which ones are which in order? Well, remember back in the kidneys, we talked about glomerular filtration rate, the GFR. Well, here we can still use GFR, but it means something different. This is the order from the outside in. G. glomerulosa, F. fasciculata, R. reticularis. Those three make the cortex. Now, how do you know which layers make which hormones? We can think salt, sugar, sex. Salt goes with glomerulosa. Salt, sodium, aldosterone. Sugar, glucose, cortisol. Sex, the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. So that's how we can kind of keep those in order. Now, what we have left is the adrenal medulla, and like I said, under the microscope, it tends to have these large open cavities where blood vessels are found. So now let's go back and talk about the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, well, medulla really just means middle. We've seen medulla in several organs now, the brain, the kidney, here in the adrenal gland. Medulla just means middle. It's the center of the adrenal gland. It's not part of the cortex. It's its own structure. It's actually a part of the sympathetic nervous system. And the cells in the adrenal medulla that make epinephrine and norepinephrine are called chromaffin cells. These make and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, here, I think it's about 80% epi and 20% norepi. Not important, but just know that it's more epinephrine than norepinephrine. Its stimulus is sympathetic nervous system activation, SNS. It's inhibited by SNS deactivation, which occurs alongside parasympathetic nervous system activation. So when the SNS is activated, that stimulates the chromaffin cells to release epi and norepi. So its function is also sympathetic nervous system. This one's weird. Its stimulus and its function are the same. It's stimulated by SNS activation in the brain. That sends action potentials to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla responds by releasing epi and norepi into the blood. What happens when you get epi and norepi into the blood? You get your fight or flight response. That's your sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system activates it, and it's the function. Hypersecretion. Typically, this comes from a tumor on the adrenal medulla. This is called pheochromocytoma. That is a crazy word, and you need to know it for lab. So pheochromocytoma is a tumor or a cancer of the chromaffin cells, and it causes them to release excess epi and norepi, a prolonged fight or flight response. So think about what that would cause. What is your fight or flight response? You get raises in blood pressure, you get increased heart rate, you breathe faster. All of the things that you associate with the SNS are just constantly happening because your SNS is constantly activated. All right, so let's look at exactly the big response of the adrenal gland. This just kind of sums it all up for the adrenal cortex. This is from a previous edition of the textbook. But more importantly, this shows us that really the adrenal gland is there to respond to stress. The adrenal gland, the whole gland is there to respond to stress. Short-term stress from the adrenal medulla, long-term stress from the adrenal cortex. But it all comes down to stress. Stress activates the adrenal gland takes over to handle that stress. All right, so that's where we will stop. We will pick up next class in the next lecture talking about the pancreas, and then we will talk about some of the other tissues that make hormones. By no means will we talk about all of them, and I will talk to you soon.